The court notice landed on my desk the same morning the harbor fog refused to lift. Malcolm Keating, 56, maritime accountant, still smelling last night's burnt coffee. I set down Dorothea's silver pocket watch flawless then, and wondered how far my parents would go. Ever been blindsided by family? The phone buzzed twice, each vibration carrying more weight than I wanted to admit. Colin's name lit up the screen, followed by the kind of message you can't unread. They filed this morning. It's about Dorothea. I stared at it, thumb hovering over the glass, as if not opening the thread would somehow undo what it said. Outside my office window, the harbor was a watercolor of rain and fog masts swaying in the early March drizzle. Rockport's fishing boats looked like ghosts tied to the dock, shifting in the swell. A thin draft slid under the sill, carrying that briny tang you only get after a night storm has scrubbed the air clean. My eyes drifted from the message to the piles on my desk. In the far corner, beneath a small stack of invoices, sat Dorothea's silver pocket watch. The case caught a stripe of dull light, the second hand ticking with the same stubborn rhythm it had since she gave it to me 3 years ago. She said it kept better time than any clock in the building because it remembers every minute it survived. I set the phone down and reached for the manila envelope that had been delivered not 20 minutes earlier. The paper was cold against my palms, the typeface on the return address stark and impersonal Knox County Courthouse. I slid a finger under the flap, the sound of tearing glue loud in the quiet. Inside a single sheet, thick stock legal paper, bold letters centered near the top, petition to dissolve retirement fund. My leather chair gave a low, familiar creak as I leaned back, letting the words sink in. Dissolve the fund. The fund Dorothea had insisted on establishing in 1989, back when no one in this family company thought about life after work. Saltwater streaks ran down the outside of the window, blurring the line between sea and sky. I flattened the petition on my desk, scanning the list of petitioners. The first 2 names were as familiar as the layout of this office, Harland Keating and Maribel Keating. My parents. The air felt heavier, as if someone had quietly closed a door behind me. I pressed my thumb into the edge of the desk until it hurt the kind of small pain that keeps you from going numb altogether. Colin's voice cut through the fog in my head when I finally called him back. It's not just about the fund, he said. They're framing it as a necessary step to modernize the company's finances. Publicly, anyway. I could hear him flipping through papers on his end, the dry shuffle of someone already knee-deep in the mess. I asked about Dorothea. He hesitated. She hasn't said much. I think she's blindsided. The coffee on my desk had gone cold, a thin skin forming on top. I didn't drink it. Instead, I let my gaze wander to the row of framed photographs along the bookshelf, Dorothea at the launching of the Maggie D. hair pinned neat under a hard hat, Dorothea at the company picnic laughing with a paper plate in her lap. The thought of her hearing about this from anyone other than me tightened my chest. I reached for the pocket watch, feeling the smooth, worn case warm under my fingers. The steady tick was almost defiant against the hush of the room. In my mind, I could see those old shipping ledgers stacked in her attic pages, foxed with age and salt ink faded to a pale sepia. My parents always hated those books, said they were relics. Dorothea kept them anyway, because relics, she once told me, have a way of making the present behave. The petition's language was dry, but the implications were soaked through with real lives. 32 retirees still drawing from that fund, some of them with no other cushion. Without it, a few would have to sell their homes. Others might not afford the winter heating bills. The numbers on the page felt like stones dropped into water ripples, spreading in every direction. Rain tapped the window, a slow metronome. I set the watch down gently, its ticking now louder in my head than the rain. This wasn't just another family argument dressed up in legalese. This was a move to erase Dorothea's work, to reduce her to a footnote in the company she helped build. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, a man balanced between two roles, son and protector. I knew which one had to win. The leather chair creaked again as I leaned forward, pulling the petition closer. The drizzle outside blurred the edges of the harbor, but the path in my mind was sharp, already drawing lines toward whatever came next. If they win, she loses everything, and so do I. The basement door was heavier than it looked, the hinges giving a slow groan as I pulled it open. The air that met me was damp, smelling of wet rope and the slow decay of cardboard. I flicked on the switch. Fluorescent tubes overhead blinked twice before holding their light, humming like an old refrigerator. Rows of shelving stood in regimented lines, each bowed slightly under the weight of banker boxes gone soft at the corners. I slipped on cotton gloves, the fabric catching on a rough patch of skin along my thumb, and walked toward the far wall. The labels were a history of someone's filing habits. Doc fees, 1996 to 97, vendor overages, 2001 board minutes, 1984 to 85. The last one made me stop. The tab was bleached almost white, the handwriting neat for the first two words, before sloping into a hurried scrawl. I eased the box forward and felt the shift of weight as something inside slid. The lid gave with a sigh, releasing a faint puff of dust. Manila folders lay inside like tired soldiers. I lifted one, and a gray film settled across my forearms. The first page minutes from June 1984, stamped in blue, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper fibers. Dorothea's name appeared midway down the attendance list in her steady, looping hand. But when I turned the page, the sequence jumped to August, then back again. It wasn't random. It had the rhythm of selective omission. 2 janitors came down the stairs, their cart squeaking voices low about the Sox pitching rotation. They nodded without slowing the scent of floor cleaner trailing behind them. I turned back to the box and pulled another folder. The paper rasped under my gloves. This one held a printout of an email from 1984, the header block dense with from to and CC lines. The sender was a benefits consultancy we'd hired during a push to modernize the fund. In the upper right, a coffee ring bloomed like a watermark. The signature at the bottom was smudged the smear running diagonally through the letters. The timestamp read 11:59 p.m. I could almost hear the fatigue in that choice of hour. I spread several documents on the rolling cart, aligning them by staple holes and curled edges. In the margin of one page, different ink, different hand. Confirm notarized copy on file. The last 3 words were underlined twice, the pen cutting faintly into the sheet. Another memo bore my father's writing, revisit fund allocation Q4 volatility. Beneath it, smaller letters D, ask counsel, refounder, language. A hum from the lights filled the silence until Clara from accounting appeared, hugging a stack of vendor statements. "You camping down here?" she asked. "Just visiting old ghosts," I said. "If you see boxes marked retirement or trust, point them my way." She set her stack on a shelf, eyes skimming the spread on my cart. "Looks like a jigsaw puzzle missing the picture." "Exactly," I said, and she moved on sneakers, whispering over the concrete. I kept sorting. A September meeting had a header repeated twice. A motion was referenced in the notes, but missing from the body. Paperclip indentations didn't match the pages they held. None of it looked accidental. My phone buzzed across the cart. Colin's voice came clipped. Opposing counsel wants a preliminary in 5 days. They'll push to freeze all disbursements. For everyone I asked. Retirees and current staff. They'll call it responsible management. I looked at the coffee-stained printout again. We need every document proving the fund's original intent. Originals if we can get them county records if we can't. Send me whatever you find tonight, he said, then hung up. I took photos, the stain, the smudge, the underlined note. The blue flash from my phone made the old paper look brittle. Another email chain ended with, "If Ms. Keating insists on founder designation, we must maintain notarized originals in county records. Company copies optional." That single word, optional, hummed in my head. The trail was pointing out of this building. On the back of an envelope I wrote, "Intent. Founder. Originals. County." I slid the most promising pages into a tote, the edges catching slightly on the canvas. Upstairs, the harbor would be losing its last light masts, shivering in the wind. On my desk, Dorothea's pocket watch would be marking time without caring who tried to control it. My parents would say the freeze was temporary prudent. The papers here told another truth. Once erasure begins, it rarely stops. I switched off the basement light. The hum died, leaving only the faint rattle of the dehumidifier. On the stairs, I scrolled to a name I hadn't used in years. Elias Morton knew where records belonged and who had moved them. 5 days wasn't much, but it was enough to ask the right question. I pressed call. The bell over the dockside cafe door gave its usual jingle, the kind that made you think of summer even in the shoulder months, and there he was, hand already raised. Elias Morton still had the same weathered face from my first day at Keating Maritime, though the years had etched deeper lines around his eyes. That raised hand was the one that had signed my hiring papers in '94, back when I was young enough to think 40 was old. The place smelled like cinnamon sugar waffles and brewed coffee so dark you could float a nail in it. Pinewood walls gave the air a faint resin tang, and the big front windows faced the harbor where gulls sketched loose spirals over the fishing boats. Elias was in the corner booth, a mug in front of him, steam curling lazily. He gestured for me to sit, and the vinyl seat sighed as I slid in. "You've been busy," he said, eyes flicking to the tote bag I'd dropped beside me. "Busy trying to read the past before someone edits it," I said, and gave him the condensed version of the lawsuit, the petition, the missing board, minutes, the coffee-stained email with founder language underlined twice. He listened without interruption except for the occasional slow turn of his mug in his hands. "When I was in your chair, he said we had a similar dust-up. Early '80s. Different stakes, same game. Someone wanted to shutter a profit-sharing plan that had quietly outperformed everything else." He shook his head. "We kept the plan, but only because we won clean." I leaned forward. "Meaning," he met my eyes, "meaning you win on the merits. No tricks, no mudslinging, no cutting corners. Win clean or the win won't matter. You carry that into the rest of your life." A waitress brought a fresh pot topping off our mugs. The coffee was hot enough to fog my glasses briefly. Elias took a sip, then set the cup down carefully. "You're going to need records they think are lost. County records. And someone who knows the back hallways there. Anyone in mind?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, watching a gull land on the pier piling outside. "Sylvie Redfern," he said finally. "If she's still there, she might be your best shot." I filed the name away, rolling it over in my mind. "You trust her. I trust her to do her job and remember what others forget. In our line of work, that's gold." The cafe door opened again, a blast of sea air carrying in a hint of diesel from a trawler. Elias leaned in, lowering his voice. "Your parents, they fear the past because it remembers too much." I felt the truth of it like the grain of the table under my fingertips. They weren't just looking to dissolve a fund. They were trying to erase a ledger that held more than numbers. Elias reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pen, and snagged a napkin from the holder. He wrote in block letters, tore the napkin in half, and slid one piece toward me. "Sylvie's number. Don't leave a voicemail. Talk to her live." I folded the napkin twice and slipped it into my jacket pocket, the paper still warm from his hand. The gull outside screeched once, lifting into the wind, and I knew the rest of the week had just taken on a sharper edge. When I stood, Elias stayed seated, hands wrapped around his mug. 5 days isn't much," he said, "but enough if you know where to look. Start with Sylvie." I knotted the napkin, a small folded weight against my chest. Out in the street, the breeze off the water carried both the salt of the harbor and the faint sweetness from the cafe. Somewhere in that mix was the first clean lead I'd had since this began. Sylvie Redfern was already at the long oak table when I stepped into the county records room. The space was narrow, with a single tall window leaking May sunlight in a gold shaft, dust motes drifting like slow sparks in its beam. Shelves lined both walls, packed with boxes in every stage of fading. She had a manila folder open in front of her, but her gaze shifted when she saw the tag on the carton I was carrying. Her eyes paused on the red, restricted stamp across its side. Then, without a word, she nudged it toward me. "You didn't get this from me," she murmured, glancing at the closed door. I eased the lid off. Inside was another smaller box, its label handwritten in a hurried scrawl. "Dock permits, 1979. The ink had bled at the edges, the kind of bleeding that happens when someone reuses a box and wants you to think it's dull." "Check inside," Sylvie said, her voice, even though she shifted slightly in her chair. The smaller box rattled when I lifted it out. The first few inches were exactly what the label promised: folded dock permits, brittle along the creases, smelling faintly of seawater. But beneath them, flattened against the cardboard bottom, was a thick, legal-sized envelope. My name wasn't on it, but Dorothea's was printed in block capitals, next to the word shareholder. I slid the envelope free and worked the metal clasp open. The paper inside was heavier than standard, the watermark visible even in the dim light. Across the top, original shareholder agreement, Keating Maritime Logistics. My pulse picked up. I turned to the last page. As I did, the chain of Dorothea's silver pocket watch snagged on the flap of my vest. Before I could catch it, the watch slipped free. The sound of glass striking concrete cracked through the quiet, a sharp, clean clink that made Sylvie's head snap up. The watch lay face down on the floor, the second hand frozen mid-tick. I bent to retrieve it, feeling the hairline fracture across the glass with my thumb. The damage was small, but enough to remind me how fragile certain things can be. I set the watch beside the open file and smoothed the signature page flat. Dorothea's name was there in her careful script, beside the titles co-founder and majority shareholder. 2 seals flanked the signatures, one from the county, one from the state. Both dates matched the year of incorporation. The notary's mark was crisp, its embossing still sharp under my fingertip. This is it, I said quietly. Sylvie's glance flicked toward the door again. If that's what I think it is, you've got more than they ever wanted you to have. It confirms her stake, legal and moral. I let the page fall back into place. She leaned in slightly. Be smart about how you use it. Documents like that have a way of disappearing twice. I slid the agreement back into its envelope, then into my leather case. The cracked watch went into my vest pocket, heavier now, as if it had absorbed the weight of the moment. You going to tell her? Sylvie asked. When the time's right. Then don't waste that time, she said, turning back to her own work as though we'd just discussed dock permits and nothing more. I stood the case under my arm and stepped into the shaft of sunlight. Dust swirled around my shoes. I thought about my parents' names on the petitioner list, the way they'd always framed the fund as a family safeguard, and about Dorothea, her careful handwriting on minutes from decades past, her steadying hand when I'd first learned the books. This single file could undo all the quiet erasures they'd been orchestrating. It could put the truth back where it belonged. But evidence I knew was only as strong as the moment you chose to reveal it. I took one last look at Sylvie, who gave the smallest of nods. Then I stepped out into the hallway, the smell of old paper replaced by the briny air drifting in from the harbor. Now all I needed was the courage to use it at the right time. The gavel hit once, the sharp crack bouncing off the oak-paneled walls like a starter's pistol. The sound seemed to hang in the warm June air, caught between the high windows of the Knox County Courthouse. Sunlight filtered through their frosted panes, catching dust in slow spirals. I sat at the plaintiff's table, palms pressed flat against my legal pad, feeling the faint tackiness of humidity on my skin. Dorothea was beside me, her cane resting against the table leg. Her knuckles were white around its curved handle, a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Across the aisle, Harland Keating leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the seat, as though this were a formality he'd already won. Maribel sat upright, her eyes on the judge, but her fingers tapping a restless rhythm against her skirt. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses and looked down at the docket. Case 22431 Keating et al. Versus Keating Maritime Retirement Fund, petition to dissolve. His voice carried the slow authority of someone who'd seen more summers than he cared to count. Opening statements began. Opposing counsel. A broad-shouldered man with a tie too tight at the neck spoke of fiscal responsibility, streamlining obligations, and adapting to modern realities. He painted the fund as an aging vessel barnacled with outdated clauses that threatened to sink the whole operation. I watched Harlan's jaw flex when the judge interrupted to clarify. We will address shareholder rights in due course. The smallest tick, but enough to tell me the phrase was a sore point. Colin took his turn, speaking calmly of the fund's original purpose, its steady performance, and the lives woven into its payouts over 30 retirees who depended on it for more than numbers in a ledger. He avoided theatrics, but his voice warmed when he mentioned Dorothea by name, noting her role in the company's founding. The opposing counsel shifted strategy, citing board minutes from the mid-'80s, the same incomplete set I'd reviewed in the basement. He spoke of evolving governance structures and absence of founding party status in extant documents. The phrasing was surgical, meant to imply that Dorothea's stake had always been a matter of courtesy, not law. I kept my eyes on the table, my hand resting over the leather case in my lap. Inside the envelope with the original shareholder agreement waited like a loaded chamber. The crack in Dorothea's watch glass had caught the morning light as I'd packed it, a reminder of how easily things could break. When the counsel paused to shuffle papers, I stood. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "I have recently located documentation directly relevant to the question of shareholder rights." A faint murmur rippled through the benches. The judge's gaze settled on me. "Have these documents been disclosed to opposing counsel?" "Not yet, Your Honor. They were recovered last month from county records under the guidance of an employee with long-standing access." Whitaker's brow furrowed. "Bring them forward." I walked to the bench, each step cushioned by the worn runner carpet. From the case, I withdrew the envelope and slid the agreement out, placing it in his hands. The paper looked almost luminous in the filtered sunlight. He adjusted his glasses again, scanning the first page, then the signatures. Dorothea's name was there in black ink alongside the notary's seal and the incorporation date. Whitaker's eyebrows rose slightly. He turned a page, then another. Finally, he leaned back. "We will recess for 30 minutes to verify authenticity and chain of custody. Counsel will approach in chambers." The gavel came down once more, the sound deeper this time. Benches creaked as people stood. The air shifted with the movement, carrying the scent of polished wood and faint cologne. I turned to gather my papers, but a shadow crossed my table. Harland stood a few feet away, his eyes locked on mine. Fury and confusion wrestled there, neither winning. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed. The muscles in his jaw worked once before he turned sharply and strode toward the door. Dorothea exhaled beside me, a sound like a sail easing in a gust. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," I said, "we wait and hope the past speaks clearly enough to be heard." But inside I knew this was only the first volley. The watchmaker peered over his half-moon glasses, the tiny silver pocket watch cradled in his gloved hands. Mr. Kessler was a man of deliberate movements, every turn of his wrist measured as though time itself obeyed his pace. He held the watch to the light, tilting it so the faint crack in the glass caught the glow from the counter lamp. "The crack will never vanish," he said, voice low, "but it can be made stronger." I nodded, the words striking deeper than the surface of the watch. Elias sat beside me on the narrow bench against the wall, arms folded loosely, eyes wandering over the framed black and white photographs of schooners and long-retired harbor clocks. Dorothea occupied the chair by the counter, her cane leaning against her leg. She looked smaller than I remembered from the courtroom, but her gaze was steady. The air was thick with the scent of oiled brass and the faint tang of metal polish. On the counter, 2 cups of tea cooled in matching porcelain mugs. The ticking from a dozen wall clocks blended into a gentle chorus, but the watch in Mr. Kessler's hands was silent. He opened the back with a practiced twist, releasing a breath of air that smelled faintly of old metal and salt, or maybe that was just my imagination tethering the watch to the harbor where I'd first seen it. Elias shifted beside me, leaning forward slightly as the watchmaker lifted out the cracked crystal. "We'll clean the movement while we're at it," Kessler said. "Dust works its way in through damage like this." While he disappeared into the back room, Dorothea began to talk not about the lawsuit, but about the early years with my grandfather. We were too busy to be afraid, she said, her hands resting on the curve of her cane. "Your grandfather believed a handshake was worth more than a contract, but I insisted we have both." Her eyes glinted. That's how the fund came to be. I listened, watching the way the light caught the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. It struck me that some cracks like the one in the watch didn't have to be erased to regain their strength. Elias turned to me. You've got a role to play in what comes next. The company will need steady hands and someone who remembers how it started. I let the words settle. The lawsuit might be winding down, but the work ahead would test a different kind of endurance. Mr. Kessler returned, holding the watch carefully in one palm. The new glass caught the light without distorting it, the face beneath unscarred except for a faint silver seam that seemed almost deliberate. He wound the stem gently, and the ticking began steady, confident, as if it had never paused. Dorothea reached for it, her fingers brushing mine as I passed it over. She held it to her ear, eyes closing for a moment. Perfect, she said softly. I slipped the receipt into my pocket, though I doubted I'd ever need proof of this transaction. The proof was in the sound, a small, insistent heartbeat against the quiet of the shop. As we stood to leave, Elias caught my reflection in the glass of the display case. A reminder, perhaps, that others were still watching how I handled what came next. Outside, the summer air felt warmer, the street alive with the scent of cut grass and distant salt water. Back at the office, a stack of freshly printed envelopes waited on my desk. Each one bore an embossed heading "Opening of Dorothea Hall." The invitations were ready. The ribbon shimmered in the late September sunlight, a bright strip of red tied across the wide double doors of the new community center. Dorothea stood at the center of the small crowd, her cane tucked under one arm, a pair of ceremonial scissors in her hands. The breeze off Rockport Harbor carried the cries of seagulls overhead, mingling with the warm scent of cinnamon rolls drifting from the reception tables inside. I stood a few steps back, watching her steady herself before the cut. The light caught in her hair, silver threads glinting like the seam in the pocket watch I now carried in my vest. Somewhere in the back of my mind I remembered the first ledger she'd let me balance my handwriting uneven numbers slightly off, but my pride unshakable. That was years before the fund, the lawsuit, and the months of quiet preparation that had led us here. With a practiced motion, Dorothea closed the blades around the ribbon. The fabric parted with a soft snap, and the crowd broke into cheers. Flags on either side of the entrance fluttered against the pale blue sky. The scent of salt water mixed with the yeasty warmth of fresh bread wrapping the moment in something both public and personal. Inside the hall was bright, the high windows spilling sunlight across polished floors. Tables held plates of cookies and loaves coffee urns steaming gently. Retired employees gathered in small groups, their voices carrying the lilting tone of old friends reunited. Children darted between the adults, their laughter skipping along the walls. At the far end of the lobby, a small glass display case stood on a walnut pedestal. I stepped toward it, the watch cradled in my palm. Elias joined me, his presence a steady shadow at my shoulder. Together we placed the restored pocket watch inside, setting it against a dark velvet lining. A brass plaque beneath read, "Founding Spirit, in honor of Dorothea L. Whitlow, co-founder and advocate." The watch caught the light, its faint silver seam visible only if you leaned close. It ticked softly, almost inaudible beneath the hum of voices. Dorothea approached her hand, brushing the glass as she read the inscription. She didn't speak, but the faint curve at the corner of her mouth said enough. Across the room, Harland and Maribel lingered near the back wall. They'd stayed through the speeches, through the applause. Harlan's posture was tighter than usual, Maribel's expression unreadable. When Dorothea moved past them to greet a group of former crew members, they stepped aside without a word. I found Elias again, and together we stood near the open doors watching the sunlight move across the floorboards. "You've done something here," he said quietly. "Not just for her." Children burst through the main hall again, chasing each other in loops, their voices ringing off the new walls. The sound seemed to lift the space higher, filling corners not even the builders had reached. Outside, the breeze picked up, carrying the faint clang of rigging from the harbor. I looked back toward the watch in its case, its reflection sharp in the glass. This building was more than a shelter for meetings and gatherings. It was a ledger entry, written in brick and wood, balanced on the truth we'd fought to restore. One small truth had changed everything and given this town back a piece of itself. The late afternoon light spilled through Dorothea Hall's windows, glinting off the pocket watch, now safe behind glass, its faint silver seam catching the glow. Standing there, I felt the months of strain settle into something steadier, like a tide turning in my favor. Justice had been served, but more than that, we had built something to last for friends, neighbors, and strangers yet to come. Sometimes bridges collapse so we can learn which ones are worth rebuilding. And when they are, they're stronger for the scars. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Share it below your story might just be the light someone else is waiting for.